Mr. Wilson.
Thank you. Professor, earlier today you were looking through a pile of personal papers relating to the case that you had brought with you, and I said if you wanted to take the opportunity at lunchtime to ascertain whether there was anything in there of significance that wasn't in the folder.
No, all I can say is that in this pile of papers, which is all I have in my folder back home, there's no printout of any of the other forensic pathologist reports. So what I heard from them was snippets given me by other people, or hearsay, but I certainly didn't have them to print out.
All right.
But I do remember having a conversation with Nat Carey some time ago.
In that case, then, it would seem fair to assume that there were 4 reports available to you at the time that you prepared your report. There was the post-mortem report, the supplementary post-mortem report, and 2 reports prepared by Dr. Swaya. Now, the post-mortem report contained a summary of the circumstances of the restraint, and Dr. Swaya's first report contained a detailed summary of the circumstances around the restraint that was based on her reading of the witness statements. And those reports and the summaries contained within those reports were available to you at the time that you prepared your report. Is that correct? Yes. Can you help me to understand then what information about the circumstances of the restraint that you didn't have at the time but you have now that has caused you to change your view as to the significance of sickle cell trait in the context of this death?
To be absolutely honest, I can't remember. Yeah.
All right. I want to ask you 1 or 2 questions about the literature around sickle cell. And can we perhaps bring up your statement again? Paragraph 63.
Yes.
I would like to recommend a book to the inquiry which may be helpful, Sickle Cell and Deaths in Custody by Simon Dyson and Gwyneth Boswell. It's basically looking at North America and Britain and the extent to which people who are black, who have sickle or sickle trait and died in custody of one sort or another, to what extent the system, which includes the pathologists and the investigators and the police, blames sickle for the deaths, when actually the deaths were caused by restraint or other things related to being in custody. Why did you recommend this book to the inquiry team?
Because this is a death in custody.
Right, and to what extent did you, or why did you consider that this book might be helpful to the inquiry?
For background information that you, your teams, and the other experts may not be aware of.
Is it a book that you've read?
Yes, I read it, I bought it in 2009 when it came out.
Now, the authors are a Simon Dyson, who I believe is a sociologist, and a Gwyneth Boswell, who's a criminologist. So neither of them are medical people.
Correct.
But from your perspective as a pathologist, as a histopathologist, did you find the book to be relevant and accurate?
Absolutely relevant in that they're dealing with what we're dealing with here. And they cite a lot of cases, at least 4 of which are mine.
So they cite at least 4 cases in which you've been personally involved.
Yep.
Are they cases involving the deaths of individuals in custody or similar circumstances?
Custody, and 3 were in custody, and 1 was in army exercises. Yes, British Army exercises.
Is there anything in the book that, from your perspective as a medical man, seems to be incorrect or inaccurate?
They get the details wrong. I know that because 2 of them, I did the autopsies myself.
And to what extent do the authors getting the details wrong impact on their overall conclusions, or what you see as the relevance of their work?
Not that much. I think the overall thrust of that book, and also the article which came out a little earlier in 2006, which you kindly sent me last night, which is basically a summary without all the case details of what's in the book, I think is broadly correct, in that when people who have sickle trait have died in custody. There has been many cases documented, and we have one in this country, which I'm sure we'll come to, where the cause of death has been put down as sickle cell trait. And in their view, and in mine, that is not justified.
Are these the sorts of issues that are explored in the book?
It is sort of, but they're not medical, as you said, so they don't really know the precise details of what goes on. But they explore it primarily from a criminological and a sociological and historical perspective. They're not terribly interested in clinical pathology.
And to what extent, if at all, have you been influenced by the book?
I think it reinforced what I already suspected. Bearing in mind the very first sickle cell trait death in custody that I was involved in looking at was back in 1995. So I'd had that experience under my belt, so to speak, already, and made me wary of what police and prison guards do or don't do.
You've mentioned the article that the inquiry team sent to you. I think we have a copy of that. It's publicly available, albeit it's not as yet been given an inquiry reference number, but it's referred to by Dr. Soye in her report.
Yeah.
So I wonder if we, just to orientate ourselves, let's bring up the article. Thank you. So it's by the same the same authors, Simon Dyson, Gwyneth Boswell. We see the article is entitled Sickle Cell Anemia and Deaths in Custody in the UK and the USA, and it was published in the Howard Journal of Crime and Justice. So it's not been published in a medical journal, it's been published in a Journal of Crime and Justice in February of 2006. And you said a moment ago that this was a precursor to the book.
Yes. Well, it must be because
the book.
Large chunks of the text are the same thing. If you compare the book with the article, you can see big paragraphs are just transferred. But the book is a great expansion. It's 10 times longer than the article.
So it appeared that the article was written first, and then this has led a few years later.
So I would presume, yes,
to the publication of the book. Now, the point has been made that this article hasn't been published on a database called PubMed. I think that was an observation by Dr. Soye. What sort of articles would you expect to find on PubMed?
Oh, that's interesting. PubMed is the biggest collection of all medical-related articles across all the disciplines of medicine, not just pathology, obviously, but everything else. And it has the titles, and these are articles rather than books. PubMed doesn't do books so much, it does public journal articles. And articles coming out all the time, and they're constantly scanned and they're put in. Not all journals get into PubMed, even if they're medical. Some of the exceptions include journals that are essentially unrefereed, that is to say, not peer-reviewed, and promoted by billionaires wanting to make their name. But it does have the core of the big journals that are, in a sense, publicly owned. They come from national public funds. The big medical journals in America and the British ones, they'll all be in there. But there's some certain fringe ones that are not there.
Okay. But is this a database of medical journals?
It's a database of medical journals. And although the title looks medical, the journal they put it in, Howard Journal of Crime and Justice, obviously doesn't. And you know, universities that run big databases will have a different set of that. If you went into a law department or criminology department in a university, they'd know about this. It's not a journal I've ever looked at before. But in fact, if you're linked into journals and went through JSTOR, you get this, because University of London will have it.
But it's not a journal or that you would expect necessarily to find within PubMed, because it's not a medical
No. I mean,
journal.
and to be honest, I don't know how Liz Swire came across it either. I never asked her. I could have done.
If we could perhaps look very briefly at the abstract, if we just scroll down a little bit to the first page of the article, and this is all we will look at. So if we pause there, we see that the authors are Simon Dyson, Director, Unit for the Social Study of Thalassemia and Sickle Cell, School of Allied Health Sciences at De Montfort University, and Professor Gwyneth Boswell, Principal Research Fellow based in London. So we see that neither profess to be medically qualified. We have a sociologist and I think a criminologist. And if we scroll down a little, please. A little further. Just to the abstract. So this gives an introduction to the article. It says, an unexplained death in custody represents an important focal point for public scrutiny of the criminal justice system, especially when excess deaths occur in those of minority ethnic descent. Sickle cell anemia is a serious inherited blood disorder disproportionately affecting minority ethnic groups. Sickle cell trait is the genetic carrier state and not an illness. The evidence suggests that the treatment of sickle cell in the criminal justice system is twofold. Justice authorities have misused sickle cell trait to explain away 10 sudden deaths, often associated with forced restraint of African Caribbean people in custody. Meanwhile, 7 deaths have been attributable to lack of provision of health care for those prisoners suffering from the illness sickle cell anemia. So that abstract simply gives a flavour of what the article is about. Have you read the article, Professor? Have you had the opportunity to cast your eye over it?
I read it quickly last night on my mobile phone, my computer not working at the moment. But I have read the book.
And from your perspective, again, as a consultant histopathologist, do you have any concerns about the medical content insofar as there's medical content in the
I'm concerned because I think they get some of the details wrong, but the overall thrust of what they say is true.
Bear with me a second, please. Thank you, Professor. There's no further questions from me. Thank you.
Okay. Rule 9 applications? 2. Professor Lucas, would you withdraw to the witness room, please?
Sure.
While I hear submissions. Ms. Mitchell. Can I just check, Ms. Mitchell, did you put any written application in?
A Rule 9, I don't know, but this arises, my lord, from something the witness said in evidence which isn't contained within his statement.
Right. Okay.
So I can get that answer to you shortly.
I don't think you did.
Yes. The situation is this witness explained that he had had several conversations on the phone with Mr. Brown in relation to the sentence which he put into his report, which he said he wouldn't do now, that about the officers involved should not be prosecuted, assuming they were approached and restrained. And what I would like to do is, with this witness, explore the circumstances of the several conversations with Mr. Brown, whether or not he has any records of those conversations, when they took place, and how it might be that they would have conversations about such matters.
Is that the matter?
Yes.
Thank you. If you could go back to your seat, and I'll hear from Ms. McCall.
I'm sorry, I didn't have a Rule 9 application in, but the matter arises out of the witness's oral testimony, and it relates to the basis for his ultimate conclusion, his conclusion having changed. And the context is that junior counsel to the inquiry spent some time exploring what material the witness had and why his opinion changed. And in my submission, it's important the inquiry understand, if it can be understood, what the possible foundation is for his ultimate view. So at page 95 of the transcript, line 18, he was asked why his opinion has changed. And he said there were two reasons. The second of those I'm not concerned with was about public information about police restraint and deaths. But the first reason he gave was he was informally given summaries and some evidence that a lot more restraint had occurred. And then at page 108, he was asked what information he had now that he didn't have before that resulted in his change of view, and he replied, "I can't remember." The first question I want to ask is, what was the source of the information and what form did the summaries and evidence take? The sources of these summaries and evidence not being recorded in any of the statements or reports he's prepared. And the second matter that arises from the same theme is that the witness said at page 107, line 16, that he'd heard snippets and hearsay and had spoken to Nat Carey. So the second thing I wanted to ask was, if it's possible that the summaries and evidence was conveyed in a conversation with another or others, who was the conversation with, when was it, and in what context did that conversation occur? Those are the matters.
Yes, thank you. Well, I'll rise us to consider these various references. Well, I shall allow Ms Mitchell and Ms McCall to ask the questions which they indicated they wish to. So can we have the witness back and Ms Mitchell? Professor Lucas, Ms Mitchell Casey, who acts for the Shekubio families, has some questions for you. Ms Mitchell.
Hello.
Thank you. I'd like to revisit something that you said in your communications with Les Brown, and that was said earlier today at 59, page 59, lines 6 to 10. I'll just read those out. In your note you put, I will not put this in my report, but what I can see of the scenario, the police officers involved should not be prosecuted, assuming they approached and restrained Mr Bio in the normal approved fashion appropriate for the perceived risk. And we've heard your evidence about that. Now, if we look at that, I'm just highlighting the word assuming, the assumption in what you said they are related to the way they were approached and restrained, and in relation to the fact that they had done everything in the approved manner commensurate with the perceived risk. Mm-hmm. So there was an assumption being made, and the reader of that particular document would be clear that you would be making an assumption in that regard.
Yes.
And in your evidence, you were asked about where that might have come from, that piece that was written in the document, because I think, as you accepted yourself, it's not something that would normally appear in a report that you would do. Your response was this, and this is at 61:22. I had several conversations on the phone, I think with Mr Brown, and I have a vague feeling that this aspect may have come up, which might have been one of the reasons I put something in. But to say it is, and then you go on to talk about why you put it in. Now, what I'd like to do is ask you about your communications with Mr Brown.
I really don't think I can remember any more than you have just reiterated, to be honest.
Okay, well, if I can just try and test the edges of that and see. You clearly said in your evidence you had several conversations with Mr Brown. Do you recall, for example, what way you would have chatted with him? Would it have been via telephone?
Telephone, I suppose.
Yeah.
Yes.
And you had, your evidence to the inquiry was several conversations.
I think so.
This
is a long time ago.
Indeed it is, and I'm sure the inquiry will take that into consideration. But we're keen to try and get as much information with regards to the communication with experts as possible. You, in having these telephone calls, would you keep any records of them?
Nope.
Would it be your habit to keep records and you simply didn't in this case, or are telephone calls something that you don't habitually record?
I can't remember it depends where I would have been in the house I think he called me rather than I called him, and I'm afraid I can't remember.
Okay. Is it your habit to record conversations that you have from people who are instructing you in reports?
Not necessarily, no.
These conversations, from the way that you've answered the question, were presumably all before you'd written your report?
I suppose so, yes.
Was there any...
I should think so. You can probably tell from the date on the emails.
Yeah, yeah. Well, yes. Yeah. Well, the date that we're looking at and focusing in on here is the date by which you'd written the report, which has the comment in it that I referred you to. You say that you might have a vague feeling that this aspect may have come up. Can you help us with why you think
otherwise
that?
I can't think why I wrote what I did. It's not something I would spontaneously have done. There must have been some prompt somewhere. in and around this that made me think, in an email, not in the report, of course, as you say, that I make some reference to this, what might happen next. Maybe I asked what might happen next to the police, or something like that.
And you believe that that might have been a prompt for you?
Yeah, and what I said, as you can see, is that if they behave properly and restrain someone in the appropriate manner, which is laid down in various training manuals and so on, then it's a very unfortunate consequence. But if they overstepped, that's different.
And can I just be clear, was the prompt a prompt by you or by the person you were
Can't
speaking to,
remember.
Mr. Brown?
I'm sorry, I cannot remember.
Can you think of any reason why the Crown might want to speak to an expert such as yourself in your area about this, given it's not your area of expertise?
They wanted to know whether sickle cell trait could have played a role in the death of Mr. Sheku Bayo. And my conclusion was yes. Now, exactly how much? Yes, we've discussed all morning, so we don't need to reiterate that. That's the only reason I was brought in, because, and one of the other people must have said, ask Lucas, he knows about sickle, or something like that.
And that opinion was given to the Crown in circumstances where the Crown knew that you were having to make assumptions about how Mr. Bayo was approached and restrained, and the interaction with him in the approved fashion appropriate for the perceived risk.
I didn't put that in the report, so I didn't frame my report with that particular thing in mind. But yes, that is in a sense correct.
You sent that information to the Crown, so the Crown had
Yeah.
it.
Okay,
Do you accept that?
yeah.
No further.
Professor Lucas, Miss McCall KC represents a number of the police officers who attended. Miss McCall.
Professor Lucas, this morning some time was spent exploring the basis for your opinion and the information that you had.
Mm-hmm.
And you were asked about the change in your opinion. You were asked about why that happened. And what you said this morning, this is at page 95, was there were two reasons. I was informally given summaries and some evidence that a lot more restraint than I had appreciated back in 2018 had occurred in this case. So that was the first reason. The second reason was about public information about police restraint and
Yes.
deaths.
Yep.
I'm interested in the first of those. So the summaries and some evidence that you were given informally. And the question I have is, what was the source of that information and what form did the summaries and evidence you were given take?
I can recall being shown conclusions or extracts from some of the other forensic pathologists who were involved in consultation, but I don't think I ever had their full reports. And I had a conversation with Dr. Nat Carey as well.
And can you remember who it was that showed you the conclusions of other people's reports?
No, not at the moment, I can't.
You also mentioned this morning, and you just alluded to it there, that you'd heard snippets and hearsay and that you'd spoken to Nat Carey.
Mm-hmm.
Can I ask if it's possible that the information that you got, sight of the conclusions and other hearsay or snippets, was in conversations? You've mentioned Nat Carey. Were there conversations with anyone else?
I don't think so.
And when was your conversation with Nat Carey? Can you give us an idea?
Sometime since 2018, which is quite a long period.
And in what context did that conversation come about?
Oh, we always talk about mutual cases. I think he said something to the version. He said, I've seen what you said about this, and I think you're wrong. So I said, yeah, why? He said, from the way you've written the report, actually, I can tell you this is, I'm trying to remember what Nat actually said. There was an awful lot more restraint than you were given credence to. It was worse to that effect, which that made me think,
And in terms of when that conversation occurred, was that, if you can recollect, before or after you were contacted by the inquiry?
The inquiry not being Mr. Les Brown's business, but the business we're here.
The team you've been dealing with here?
That will be... When was I contacted by the inquiry? Can you tell me? Because you made the contact.
I think that we can't expect Ms. Wiley to give evidence, Professor.
But she might have a date. That's all I'm looking
I
for.
think if you can concentrate on the question that Ms. McCall is asking, whether it was before or after that contact came from the inquiry.
It might well have been before, actually.
And when you were contacted by the inquiry and you're giving your statement to the inquiry, which was back in December of
Yes.
last year,
That's following a conversation in October with my learned friend here.
right?
Yeah.
Did you at any point advise the inquiry of the conversations you'd had with Nat Carey?
I don't think I mentioned him by name, but if I did, it would have been in the transcripts, because that statement is not a written statement, it's a transcript of a phone conversation. So if it's not there, his name wasn't mentioned.
I understand that.
Or it was decided not to include it when it was transcribed.
All right.
I didn't do the transcription.
All right. Just for clarity, I presume, I may be wrong, but I presume the inquiry team sent you a copy of the proposed statement and asked you to
Yes.
give you the
Oh,
opportunity
yes.
to check it over.
Yes, that's what I did.
All right. So as far as the source of this information was concerned, additional information, we've identified Nat Carey as a source. Is there any other individual that you can identify as a
Not
source?
that comes to mind. Don't know even socially the pathologist involved in the original autopsy back in 2015. I didn't even recognise their names,
All right.
and I never met them.
Thank you, Professor Lucas. Thank you, sir.
Professor Lucas, thank you very much for coming to give evidence to the inquiry. I'm grateful to you for the time you've spent on it. I'm about to rise now, and you'll be free to go then.
Okay, thank you.